Okay, we're live. I'm here with Milo, and we're just going to talk about some books, specifically or mostly focus on Carl Jung and the Jungian books because we found that it's tricky because a lot of times people don't know where to start and kind of the game plan for handling Carl Jung and his massive collective works. So we're gonna talk about that today. Um, I have read most of it, although mostly what I've done is gone through all the audio versions that I could, just because uh, not exclusively. What works well for me is I go through the audio and then I'll have the text usually at hand so I can, review it, study it, highlight it, copy and paste and put on Facebook groups if I need to, those kind of things. But sometimes I'll go through the books as well. Just kind of depends, and it's good to experience it different ways. But Milo is a guy on our Facebook groups for mostly the Jungian focus, and a lot of people are kind of wondering at first, like, where do we go from here as far as Carl Jung's collected works and all that. Um, so first of all, Milo, I want you to just kind of tell us a little bit about your experience with Carl Jung and his collected works, and then we'll just kind of discuss how somebody else might want to get involved in these type of books.
Well, my interest in him has been for quite some time.
I don't know if it's. I'm
Can
not
you hear
hearing
me?
you very well, but I don't know if it's my thing. Hold on.
Here, can you hear me better now?
I can, but hold on one second. Try it again.
Can you hear me?
Shoot.
How am I?
One second. Okay, I'm having trouble with this cord, so you talk for a minute, and we'll either have some feedback issues sometimes, or I'm gonna get this to work another way. But just tell me a little bit about how you got into Carl Jung's collected works and that type of books, and then from your experience, what might be ways people can, um, like what they might want to attack first, and that sort of game plan, and what's worked for you.
Well, Jung's works he's very difficult to read straight up. I think the first place to start would be the memories, dreams, and reflections. That gives you kind of like a little bit of a feel about how he thinks about things. But there's like reading him. It helps to have like a background in like symbols, mythology, religion. If you don't have too much of a background in that, he's going to be very difficult to read. He's already difficult to read, especially when you get into his alchemical works. When you start to get into those, it helps to have a little bit of a background in symbolism. The little understanding of mythology and the symbolism in mythology. I mean, you might even think about like coming at him through some secondary authors first. There's some of them like, is it Edinger? Some of his stuff is pretty more accessible, as well as like Murray Stein has written a few books about him, about his stuff. Reading some of those authors, if you don't have a background, I think it probably helps get your head around it.
Yeah. Okay. Um, Let me see. Yeah, the ones I would gravitate to sooner than later are yeah, uh, yeah, Edinger for sure. Although I was talking a little bit about the other day how I feel like some of those their goal was similar to like what we're after, where we want to make it more accessible for just kind of the average guy. But the with Edinger and Marie Louise von Franz, they are moderately accessible compared to maybe normal, but not totally completely. And sorry, got someone with me, but uh, so yeah, I would say, like you said, start with memories, dreams, reflections. This is another easy one, or at
Yes.
least read
Mhm.
the first part of it that's by Jung. Ideally, all of it, but if someone gets stuck, the best ones I think are the first part by Jung, and then the uh, individuation process by Marie Louise von Franz, and then that's kind of the start of it. And then one thing I like to tell people is don't go straight to um, uh, 9. Don't go straight to volume 9 like a lot of people try to do, just because that's sort of the most quoted, probably, or well, what happens is people find out about archetypes and the collective unconscious, and those are the two most common like ideas that people are looking to get into with, you know, in ideas, and that's not really the place to start. Edward Edinger talks about a lot how that the about volume 9, at least by the time he got to part 2, which was Aeon, he stopped speaking so directly, and so it was more like a explicit rather than, or no, up until about 9, at least 9 part 1, it was more um, explicit, whereas after that it got more experiential, or like you've got to really wrestle with it after that. um, So also the other thing to keep in mind is 1 through 5. Well, okay, so 1 through 4 is his stuff when he's kind of young. He's like in his 20s and 30s, barely even getting into psychology. In chat and volumes 1, 2, 3, 4, and then volume 5. Uh, it has a bunch of different titles depending on the translation and the edition, but volume 5 is the big one as far as his split with Freud, because that's where he's talking about the libido, and it's tricky there. It almost seems like in volume 5 he lacks a lot of social tactfulness, because he just goes very directly while he's working with Freud and writing volume 5, and just speaks against Freud, like Freud's method is wrong. And he also talks about Adler's methods. So yeah, basically stick to 5 with that understanding. For the most part, I don't know, you probably read more 1 through 4 than I have, but for the most part, people can skip 1 through 4, but it's more of just like some interesting extra stuff. And then 5, 6, 7, 8 are where it starts to get into things. 6 is um, uh, psychological types, where they start talking about what do you call it? What became the Myers-Briggs test of, you know, sensation, feeling, thinking, all those things. But the interesting thing a lot of people don't realize about 6 is that's where he starts going into his own definitions. And so he starts giving his own definitions. And that one was actually um, updated. I think it has like 5 editions. So the later editions will give a nice, succinct definition for things like unconscious and all that. But then 7 is two, I think I have it. 7 is 2 essays on analytical psychology, but this is where he first talked about the archetypes of the collective unconscious, and also an 8. And so I mentioned those because 7 and 8 are where you can start to get a grasp on archetypes in the collective unconscious before that actual volume 9 that's called Archetypes in the Collective Unconscious. And then 10 on are a little more difficult to sort of grapple with, as far as not all of them, but at least Aeon, which is 9 part 2, the sort of the religious ones, which is 10, and then the alchemical one, and probably the hardest one that I barely got into, which is Mysterium Connectionis. And then I think in the religious one is Answer to Job, which is very important but a little tricky. But it starts to make sense at the end. But anyway, I'll let you kind of say what your experience has been with those volumes.
Yeah, I think Jung, the way he writes, he doesn't write in a straight linear fashion like.
Yeah, he calls it a circumambulation.
Yeah, and he kind of like bounces around things and all kinds of little pieces to things, and then he starts to put them together. And then he starts looking at all these little pieces again, and he starts to talk about their intersection, and then eventually he kind of wraps it up in a paragraph or two, or a page or two, or 3, and so you can't expect in reading him because he's always looking at things from so many different angles that like he'll talk about the collective unconscious in one way here, he'll talk about it with a different shade of meaning over there, and then it's kind of I'm kind of glad that I started at 1 and I just went through, because it was little pieces just kind of start to add up, and you start to get this picture.
Did you read Symbols and MDR first, by the way?
What's that?
Did you read Man and His Symbols and Memories, Dreams, Reflection beforehand?
Yeah, those are the first books that I read. Memories, Dreams I read actually many, many years ago. And for whatever reason, I got sidetracked, and I was like really excited about him, but I got sidetracked and just picked it up in the last couple of years. But he's brilliant. There's so many different little seeds that pop up, and and you find that you have to kind of push yourself through certain sections. Some of these books, especially in these alchemical texts. You recommended you recommended this book.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, you just got it, huh?
This is
it has a tricky name. Sometimes I have trouble remembering the name. That's the Edger one. Did you get the Marie-Louise von Franz book yet?
No, not yet.
Okay.
But that's
they're both good.
And I think maybe I should have read these books beforehand. But on the other hand, I think these other authors, they're more or less synthesizing, a little bit better, or it's a little more organized. Jung, and the downside of Jung, he's not as organized as you would like sometimes with these types of things.
Well, but I talked about this a little bit the other day, but the other tricky thing is, so he really wanted to ally with Freud early on, because Freud was the only one ever really talking about the unconscious at all back at that time in the early 20th century. And then, as you see, especially in Volume 5 and some others, he says Freud kind of had it wrong. So he's figuring it out, really.
Yeah.
And that's why it's important to start with symbols and MDR, because it's at that level where he's got it figured out, and he tries to kind of just present it as much as he can in a digestible way in those two books. But then when you read the collected works, I mean, there's definitely some of it where it's like, okay, that part he's definitely got it figured out about as much as he can. But then there's some of it where he's kind of figuring it out. Plus, Edinger, who wrote that book you just showed, the way that he describes some of his writing or Jung's writing, is that usually each paragraph represents a psychological fact, which is a little difficult. I don't know if we can totally even get into that, but you kind of have to experience that. So basically, read, next time somebody's reading some Carl Jung and they're broken into paragraphs, normally you think of like a sentence and they're talking about a fact, but usually a paragraph will be talking about a psychological fact. So it's like an invisible thing you can't just describe, like you can describe even an atom or some material thing. And that's why he has to kind of go around it with these ideas, because he says that he's an empiricist because you can experience these psychological facts just by living your life and reading books and going through psychoanalysis and everything else. So yeah, that's some more tips on how to read Jung. And then also it helps too, one reason why I just got into Facebook groups and things like that is just because it really helps to have talks with other people about it, and yeah, definitely to also read from some other authors. So yeah, and then I don't know if you had anything else as far as one thing I really want to try to help people that are new to it is, that's a really common question, is like where to start, but then also try to have a game plan for how to not get stuck, because that happens too. And so like the game plan as far as like if there's maybe stuff people should skip or anything else or come back to.
One thing in reading him, I think you want to go into it. You have to suspend your preconceived notions about how everything is, because he's challenging, and he turns things upside down, and he looks at things in a way that you're probably not. Sometimes it almost seems counterintuitive until you realize how intuitive it really is.
Right.
I think another book that might be good to even read before him is The History and Origins of Consciousness by Eric Newman. That book is a very good book, and it
also one thing I want to mention about that book, I have another one by Neumann that I'm trying to get into right now.
Neumann.
Yeah, but now one thing I want to mention about that is the foreword to that book is written by Jung, and one thing that he sort of says famously in that book, or the foreword that Jung wrote, was that like we were saying a minute ago, how that Jung was kind of figuring it out at that time, but by the time Neumann and then Marie-Louise von Franz and Edinger came along, it was kind of figured out. So, and I feel like those are the best places to focus on, is really just a few of Jung's work, and if you're really dedicated, you can get to most of the collected works over time. But Edinger, Neumann, Marie-Louise von Franz, and then I haven't gotten to Iliada yet, but I know that's another important book, or a couple of books by Iliada that also are recommended on the same thing. Another, go ahead.
On Eliada, I think reading his History of Religions, there's 3 volumes.
Yep.
I read that before I started reading Jung as well, and that is that kind of, if you don't have too much, if your knowledge in religion is limited to some degree, that will fill out a lot to where you can it'll be a lot easier to follow him, because he's assuming that you know a great deal about Christianity. He's going to assume that you know a great deal about
with Iliada.
Yes, and going through something like that, and the history of consciousness, Neumann does a very good job in kind of going through some of the symbolism and mythologies and everything. That is a really good book, I think, to help prep you to enter into it, because you'll have better shelves in your head to kind of take it. As far as you mentioned, like in terms of like when you getting stuck with him, it's easy to get stuck. And I'll tell you what pushes me forward is I know that there's gems in here. Yeah, it's almost like it's like rock hunting or something, you know. There's treasure in here, and I know that there's treasure in. And as stuck as you get, you may be 3 pages away from a paragraph that's going to blow your mind, and you'll be, man, it's awesome, So I think if you a guy like Jung, there's just so much treasure in his writings. When it gets dry, just know that right around the corner, there's something great's going to pop up. So, and it always does with him.
Yeah. And let me see. Yeah. So, another project that I kind of picked up and put down, and I want to finish. It's just tricky because I'm not sure if it would be in vain. I'm trying to put together a good sort of proper index of the ones that are available in audio form, because some of it is just not even whole volumes, but just like a couple really good chapters that somebody recorded on YouTube that are good. And then I know at least volume 5 and 6, some of 1 through 4, but definitely volume 5 and 6 you can get on Audible. And I think that's it. But from there, it's just parts of 7 through 10. And then there's some others that I just talked about on YouTube. But the reason I mentioned those is just because I'll read them sometimes, and it is hard to just keep going, kind of gem hunting, like you say. But with the audio, it's just kind of being drilled into you, and you got to just make the most of it. And I feel like the audio is really good too, just because you can, you go back to it. Also, it's just convenient that every time you stop, if you need to stop, it'll be right where you left off for the most part. So yeah, I mean, there's at least some of 1 through 4, all of 5 and 6 are on Audible, and for the most part, I think they're getting to the open source or open domain, or at least the earlier editions are. So I don't think there's a big deal with the copyright issues on. I'm not sure about some of the later volumes, but I mean, also Symbols, Man and His Symbols is on YouTube. Memories, Dreams, Reflections is on YouTube. Professional versions, which, like we said, for the most part, that's where to start off. So yeah, that's basically the other thing I'd mention too. forgot last time I was talking about this. It helped me a lot too, even though I don't agree as much with Joseph Campbell. He borrows a lot from Jung and talks about Jung's, archetypes and everything. So Joseph Campbell was really good, and it helps to just have perspectives from people that maybe even don't completely agree with it, but they'll usually, if they do and they say this is Jungian, but this is where I differ, that's maybe not Jungian, they will lay that out. But getting those kind of perspectives, like from Joseph Campbell, really help. Also, the other thing that Joseph Campbell did, at least in his first volume of the anthology, The Mask of God, is he kind of tried to lay out a more scientific representation. So that's kind of, he laid out the evolutionary biology sort of perspective, which is how I'd have to go back and look for all of his terminology. But he talks, I think the term is innate response mechanisms. So that's talking about how when turtles, for example, are hatched, their mothers are long gone in the ocean. Not all of them, but or maybe it's tortoises, but for the most part, turtles are hatched. Their mothers are long gone. There's no other adult turtles around, and they know somehow, it's encoded into their DNA, you could probably say, that as soon as they hatch, they can't just figure out the world. They've got to run for the water, and it's got to be to, like, as soon as they can, into the water as much as they can. And the reason is because it's probably a natural selection too, because the ones that don't do good at that get eaten right away, because there's birds that are hovering and grab up the slow ones or the stupid ones that are going the wrong way. And he gave other examples of that, and so it's similar to an archetype, where an archetype is more like, probably the most common one, I've heard someone give this example, sort of, is that the mother archetype, for example, we all play a role in that, in the mother archetype. But for a biological mother, a female that becomes an actual mother, it's like archetypally that's sort of set up, and then as soon as that actually happens, she's pregnant, all those things, then there is more it's I heard somebody describe it as like a dry riverbed, and then that also happens just with the characters and stories, and identifying with parts of our psyche, whether that's the ego, the shadow, the anima animus, or different parts that are repressed or suppressed compared to things that are more out in the open. So anyway, it's really important, because the more you understand these type of things, especially unconscious archetypes, then and this why I kind of got focused on this idea for like a year or two, is because I feel like the more one figures out that issue first, then as you get into other things, even just in life, but also in Jung's work and all kinds of books, then things start to make more sense, because that sort of archetypal structure is in every good book or work of art on some level. But I don't know.
Yeah, I think what you're kind of getting at is Jung is he's not a clean slate advocate, that you're born with a clean slate and you learn all these, your culture and everything. And he's saying that deep in our psyche, just like as the instinct of the sea turtle to go to the ocean, we have structural elements in our psyche, these archetypes
Right.
that provide an order to every man or woman's psyche in all of
Mm-hmm.
humanity, the beginning to present,
Mm-hmm.
and getting your head around that, that there's that commonality between all of humanity that we all share,
Mm-hmm.
is kind of where that's where he sets apart from Freud, because I mean Freud, the
Right.
unconscious is just like the refuge of what the conscious doesn't want to deal with,
Right.
what it censors or.
Yeah, Freud was more like we are a clean slate sort of thing.
Mhm.
And I feel like over the year, sort of what Jung was getting at or figuring out, and then that we figured out more in the decades or so since then, is that it's always going to be a combination of um, what's born into us naturally, and some of it is common or collective, and then some of it is more unique to certain individuals or some people having certain tendencies towards one thing or another than others. Um, but it's always going to be a combination of what's born into us and then sort of the environment unlocking that. So um, if you just live a safe and boring life, then your environment won't unlock your consciousness, unlock your DNA, unlock transformation in you. But at certain points in your life, and books and stories and literature and art, and uh, even just understanding movies and the archetypes of the hero and everything else, then it opens your mind just to how that our consciousness transforms over time. Um, but yeah, it's always a combination of both. What we're born with, which is mostly potentiality, because like a lot of times people make this distinction that um, humans are born at least 2 to 3 years premature, because we're sort of born that we just got to have these huge brains. So we're born like just enough so that a human being can survive, but with a lot of attention and nourishment and everything else from our parents and family. Because most other animals, they can roughly get started in life almost right away or within a few months. But we're born so premature so that we can grow into those potentialities of our psyche and whatever environment that we're in, because we could be in a lot of different kinds of environments. And our culture could call on any individual to be a lot of different specialized things. And that's kind of what makes us unique. And then, and he gets into this, the stages of life too. I think it's in volume 8. Yeah. Where, for first, I forget what he calls the maybe it's the pre-sexual stage, but early on in life, it's just kind of becoming a almost like a functional human being up until your teenage years. And then you've got that sort of sexual phase in your teenage years to your at least early 20s roughly. And then that and then at 25 is when your brain is finally fully formed, which Jung didn't really get into, but he talked about sometimes in the mid 20s how that's when you're kind of like finally formed. But then I forget if he called it this or it's called in similar writings, but at 25 to 35 ish is like the warrior phase, where then you're fully formed. Nietzsche talked about it too in his, you go from the camel to the lion to the child, but that's these phases of life. And so then Jung talked a lot about how the middle age is what most people would call it, somewhere in the mid 30s to mid 40s. Most people, that's when they kind of start their sort of individuation process, because just like when you went through everybody goes through a sexual phase, or puberty at least. Then you go through another phase where you've got to be a responsible adult, approximately in your mid-20s, and start doing something in the world, uh, make make a niche for yourself or whatever. Then usually in the mid-30s to mid-40s, you find out that all that was kind of wrong and you've been doing it wrong. And that's when kind of like the unconscious comes up and starts demanding more of you. And that's when usually the sort of individuation process will start for most people. Um, so human beings are very complicated, and we have to remember that, because good psychological writings take all that into account, because that's why in our communities, whether it's political or whatever else, someone who's 20 and loud is going to have one voice, even if there's a million of them, that with somewhat respect, but at the same time, someone else who's double their age and focusing on making the world a better place, they're going to have a different voice and a different experience, because just the same way that we're not born a clean slate, same thing, when we become an adult, when we become 18, 19, 20, we've still got a lot of growing left to do. So, those are some other things that, Jung kind of gets into, but his stuff kind of goes all over the place. It's tricky because he also talks about all kinds of mythology and astrology and synchronicity and stuff that I've just barely even gotten into. But I'm trying to find ways to make it more practical for myself and others that we discuss it with.
I think it's significant. The thing about Jung is that there's like a wisdom to him. That he kind of, he sees that, and what he sees the value in the development of the ego, which, like, in the stage of development leading up to middle age, is kind of like the maturing of your ego, and because the ego has to adapt itself to life, and he places a big emphasis on adaptation to life, and without a mature ego, once you get into moving your center from your ego to yourself, which he gets into, if the ego hasn't matured yet, there's all kinds of problems that we do.
And I feel like what usually happens, this is part of what we'd call the hero's journey, although Jung doesn't get a lot into the hero's journey. Neumann sort of does in his works, and then of course Joseph Campbell in his little bit different way does a little bit more, although that's something more that you just kind of experience in life and literature. But the way that I kind of look at that sort of like maturation of the ego is that between early adulthood and roughly middle age, what you're roughly trying to do is, and to sort of use a biblical metaphor, it's like you're trying to make the best sacrifice, because whether you can sacrifice your ego in that time period or not, it's going to be crushed. So at some point in midlife, between roughly 35 and 45-ish, your ego is going to get crushed, whether that's, and a lot of that too is just the experience that, before that, you might have had like one thing happen, like a dog died, or you lost a job or whatever. But by the time you get into between, late 30s, early 40s, you start to get a bunch of those things, which are like the real meat of, experiential consciousness in life, which is if you do a bunch of, like, somebody dies, lose a job type situation, maybe you have to move when you don't want to, and then, lose a relationship. And that's where it's like you built up your psychological structure of how that you feel like the world should work, and then it all falls apart. You're in the underworld and you have to put it back together, which is relatively easy if you do one or two of those, but usually in midlife you're doing sometimes three of those within a year or a couple of years. But that's the crushing of the ego, and then usually what'll happen is that's how the hero who can survive that comes out like a real, somewhat individuated human being, compared to some people refuse the challenge, refuse the call indefinitely, maybe for their whole lives, and then that's how they become alcoholics, or 50 or 60-year-old children or 70-year-old children sometimes, because they kind of get stuck in that Peter Pan stage. They don't want to grow up. They don't want to face life. And even Nietzsche talked about it a lot, which was we can use religion and we can use alcohol and a lot of different tools the wrong way, which is to help us not feel and experience life. But if we go through those experiences, that's where it's like a Jung would call it individuation. Christianity might call it redemption. I forget the words they use for it in Buddhism, but it has one of the first steps is the ego death, and then that's where you get the sort of reblossoming from there, and then that's how you have mature adults. But not everybody makes that journey.
I think it's worth noting that in the East, there's more of this concept of ego death,
right?
And in Jung, it's not so. It's a death of a sort, but it's
right.
It's more or less the ego giving up its self-conscious rule of being the self. Your ego thinks itself is you are who your consciousness thinks you are, and it hasn't included the unconscious and the self, that unifying principle that's deep within us, our true self or whatever. The individuation process is where the center kind of moves from the ego to that deeper self, and then the ego is needed still to interface and adapt to the world. So the ego, if it hasn't been fully developed, then it doesn't know how to bring the contents of the unconscious into realization in an adaptive way without an ego that's been developed. So Jung says that the ego then becomes more or less a mediator between the self and life in its mature sense, as opposed to dying out completely or eliminating it. It isn't an elimination. It's more of its function changes from being like king to administrator. I like to think of it that way, but I think that's Jungian essentially.
Roughly. And I would agree with that. It's tricky, and I'm not as well versed in the Eastern philosophy as I'd like to be. Although I think, both in East and West, some of what the sort of process of redemption or process of transformation is probably the best terminology that they're talking about. A lot of it is metaphorical language, or symbolic language. But also, even if it's saying directly you're going to do this, there's an unconscious thing going on, whether it's talked about or not. So like with ego death, for example, it's not like, that is largely what they're after, especially in their specific language, but sort of what ultimately happens is the same thing in the individuation process, which is it's not like you don't have an ego anymore. It's that it's this more of an emissary, as what's his name? Ian McGilchrist, which is another one people should definitely read. He talks about the master and the emissary, where the master is he's a psychiatrist, more on the scientific aspect. So he's talking about the hemispheres, and so the right hemisphere being the master, or which is the unconscious, and then the left hemisphere being the emissary, which is more of the ego consciousness. And biologically, they're both inhibiting each other constantly, and that's mainly what they're doing is kind of like figuring out. They're like warring with each other, or getting each other to kind of like shut up or whatever. But in McGilchrist, he talks about how that the emissary, which is sort of the ego consciousness, has kind of run amok, or taken on the wrong role in the modern world, at least. But that we can kind of put that position back where it's supposed to be. So yeah, there's a lot of different angles to go at it. The other one that I'd mention too is Ken Wilber. I've only read a couple of his books so far, but some of it talks directly about Jungian things, and then he's a little bit more on the Eastern philosophy type of thing. But he'll talk directly about the archetypes and collective unconscious. And yeah, so the thing with Jung too is he's very going at it from a psychiatric perspective, going at it from his goal is to be able to help people solve their complexes and everything else, typically through analysis, although also through just moral living and creativity and everything else. And so that's his perspective. And and the reason he really goes into all these different things of religion and mythology and everything else is because he's withdrawing our projections, and often that would be done in analysis with him, or a Jungian analysis, or a Jungian analysin, or whatever. And so if someone's from a Western background, they're not going to talk about the Eastern stuff, although that can be useful as like an illustration. And then vice versa, if someone's more of a Eastern focus, they'll focus on that, which is really, really useful, because otherwise, some other type of psychologist will just kind of say like, yeah, sure, religion, whatever, and dismiss it. If you're trying to solve issues in psychological analysis through the typical means or typical schooling, it can be damaging, even because they'll dismiss a lot of real psychological experiences, and which is kind of what needs to happen, because there's a lot of important reality and important valuable things that people have gone through in the religious experiences. And so what is like the most ideal thing is to sort that out as far as what religious experiences can be helpful, and then which ones can potentially be damaging. So rather than just be like, oh, shut up, your religion sucks, it's not real, figure out what can be helpful and what to avoid. And that way the person can use all that information to mature and individuate, as Jung puts it, or transform.
I think it's worth noting that, in religious experiences, I think the danger isn't as much in the experience itself as it is in the interpretation of the experience. You might have an ecstatic experience, and then you might turn it into, it could turn into a megalomania situation where your consciousness becomes essentially becomes unconscious. It becomes possessed by the archetype of the experience.
Right.
And so the dangers are really, how to contain the archetype in an adaptive way to society.
It's about, like Jordan Peterson talks about, bringing order from chaos. And so that's what happens with a lot of these philosophies, ideologies, dogmas, whatever you want to call them, is over time we've been figuring out which parts are problematic and which parts are useful. And like I talked about, was it when you were on? Anyway, the idea that one advantage to the Christian motif or mythology or story, whatever you want to call it, is it helps escape the ego trap, where people sometimes get caught in the more Eastern sort of teachings, which is, I want more enlightenment, I want more power, I want more. And then they're stuck because it's this whole ego game, and it can easily lead to ego inflation. But if there's now a lot of them will sometimes get into a more less personal divine, which is sort of what that they're sort of working towards, but it's still an ego trap. Whereas if there's at least on some level, personal divine, so to speak, that you can surrender to, give it up to, sacrifice to on some level, whether it's in a mythology, a story, a symbolism, or whatever works in prayer or whatever, that escapes the ego trap. But I mentioned that too because of what you were just saying, where people can use the same exact sort of tool to escape responsibility, which is one of the dangers that we're looking out for. Whereas, we can just say, sometimes people are like, oh, the devil made me do it, or they could say, well, I guess that's the Lord's will, that kind of thing. So that's part of the whole sorting out these complexes kind of thing, is to kind of say, what are the proper values and the proper ways that we want to live out life, and then use the tools that come from these mythological teachings to mature, individuate, transform in the right way but not the wrong way. And that's what we're working on.
Yeah, I think that in large part what happens is, when archetypal images enter into one's life, the ego that was developed up to that point, the degree to which it's embodied the virtues like love and humility and a lot of character things. And Jung would talk about this, all throughout his writings, that type of person you are, your goodwill, these kinds of things are important in helping to mitigate the archetypal force, because they're so powerful that they're liable to overwhelm the consciousness.
Yeah. So anyway, I think, yeah, that's I think a good sort of almost an hour introductory to these kind of things, and what I was trying to get at with these goals. The other ones that we'll kind of start to wrap it up here in a second, but the other ones that I'd kind of mention on those lines, other than what we've talked about, some that I've mentioned before, of course, Jordan Peterson's not just his 12 rules for life, but also maps of meaning. He gets more into the Jungian ideas. And then the one that originally kind of got me started on this was Robert Greene's Laws of Human Nature. He talks about the shadow specifically and some other Jungian ideas, but more in a way that just about anyone could grab a hold of. So those are some others to start with too, because you want to take these things at a lot of different angles, so that by the time you get through it, you've got these epiphanies. Like a question that I brought up earlier that we had a little thread on was, kind of like what brings about an epiphany or what the ingredients are. And so you made the point that it has to do with like a breaking moment. I forget the exact terminology, but also things that are in the unconscious. So a lot of times what you want to do is you're not going to get a lot of this right away, but the more you put it into you, then it'll kind of come together and you'll have epiphanies depending on what else is going on when you're reading in your life. So
Yeah,
I don't know if you have anything else to add on those lines.
yeah, I think when your consciousness comes to its limit,
Yeah,
and to be able to recognize I've hit the limit of what I can consciously do, and
right.
you almost have to like let go of your attachment to your intellect to allow the insight, intuition, access to the unconscious. And I think we run into this when we hit problems in life. Where
Yeah,
those when we hit problems and hit obstacles, and when we encounter the unknown, these are like the opportunities in which we can begin to like have a relationship with our unconscious that where epiphanies are possible. But they're never going to happen if we think we're in control. They're never going to happen if you know it, if you know the answer to everything. They're not going to happen,
right.
When you have to recognize your limits and limits of the mind to grasp certain things.
Yeah, it's like a breaking and a surrender, and there's a lot of examples. I can't think of them all now, but like one of the sort of founders of algebra, I forget his name off the top of my head, but he had this experience where he had been working on sort of like making what we now know as algebra or some of the fundamental algebra. This was, I don't know, 200 years ago or so, maybe 300 years ago. Anyway, so he got himself in a dual situation, when that was a thing in the 18th, 19th, early 20th century. And so he knew he was going to die the next day. And so all these problems that he was stuck on for a long time of, Robert Greene and a couple of his books, he calls it the death ground strategy, where sometimes we can sort of simulate that, where we kind of pretend that, or we get our backs up against the wall to produce something, whether it's a creative thing or something in whatever work. And sometimes that'll force things out of the unconscious and make them come together if we're in one of these situations where it's like a now or never kind of thing. But what happens is, so what you want to do is feed the unconscious as much as you can, and then whatever is going on in your life, especially big deadlines that you can put on yourself, they will then at times force those things to come together and make sense for whatever that you're working on. But anyway, I think we'll wrap it up here in just a minute, and we're also going to be talking some of this that we didn't really get into. We're going to get into more on Thursday, because we're still dealing with that discussion that was started by Jesse over with the Resurgent Us group on the Sam Harris Jordan Peterson debate / discussion. So we're going to be talking about the third discussion, and we'll put together some questions beforehand, talk about that for about 2 hours. On Thursday, it'll be 7 Eastern, 4 Pacific, and that's the plan. So I don't know if you have anything else you want to add before we wrap this up, Mel.
I think another source that might help somebody encountering Jung is listen to Jordan Peterson's. He does a series on Genesis.
Yeah.
In interpreting the Genesis stories, and he uses Jungian kind of approach to it. And I think that going through those would help get you into the right mindset to kind of absorb a lot of Jung's material.
Yeah, and I would just say on that note, all the Jordan Peterson stuff that anyone has the time to get to, as much as sometimes people complain about Jordan Peterson for whatever reasons in our woke culture or whatever, it's like they are most of his stuff is just available online for free as far as his lectures and everything else. The only thing anybody like, 'cause that's one thing that sometimes people say, oh, he's just a charlatan trying to make money off people or whatever. But almost everything that is worth, you know, reading of his or hearing is available on YouTube for free. You've got all of his classroom lectures, all the way back to the 90s in Harvard. Um, but all that helps just understand. I don't I don't know if you could call him specifically a Jungian, but he definitely uses the Jungian because he's more of an eclectic kind of a approach in his sort of methods. So, but like I said, like I like to look at the same things from Ken Wilber and Joseph Campbell and some others, so you get like some of these other perspective. Because usually what they'll try to do is say this is what Jung's getting at. This is where maybe he sees a little bit differently. He gets into one I didn't really mention, but uh, Jean or Jean Piaget is one that Peterson's really big on too, where uh, he's kind of talking about the whole it's like the meta game where uh, the game of games of life unlocks these potentialities throughout our lives, which is a Jungian concept. So there's a lot of other people, like even well, most of the people that Jordan Peterson gets into, the psychologists and even Dostoevsky and Nietzsche, they're very Jungian, and especially the way that Jordan Peterson will present them. But the way that Jordan Peterson tries to present them is, as much as he can, put it more down to at least the level of an undergraduate college course so that most people can grasp it. So yeah, definitely as much as Jordan Peterson as people can get into. And even if they don't like Jordan Peterson, that's actually a good exercise for people. Like, and that's one thing I would highly recommend for anybody is if there are good uh, writers out there that they don't like, go listen to them as much as you can, or good writers or lecturers. That's one exercise that really helped me a lot, listening to a lot of different writers and lecturers that I kind of didn't like because maybe I didn't agree with them or some ideas that I wasn't as familiar, as comfortable with. But spending a lot of time listening to or reading them made me have to uh, somewhat either come to understand them or at least come to the understanding of why that I disagree with them. And then it's really helpful too, because then when I'm dealing with those ideas or people who have those ideas in the world, then it's not just this like mysterious, I don't like that guy, but I know exactly why and where we might meet or differ. And then I can have these conversations. And it helps too with, like, on the Peterson Sam Harris debate, for the most part, I can see both sides of it. Uh, Harris's moral landscape is a little tricky because the whole thing with the atheism thing, we'll kind of wrap it up, but it's just that, sure, I can see a lot of the whole, really what they bring to light more than anything is that faith is faith. It's like, okay, cool, faith is faith. Everybody already knew that. But they want like reason and rationality and empiricism and evidence and everything. It's cool, great, thanks. Faith is faith. But then they don't have anything to put their morality into. And Harris and some others try to give things like that moral landscape, but it doesn't really seem to work as far as on the morality side. So, but the more you can understand other people's perspective, especially those that disagree with, the better. So, yeah. So that's basically it. Some of the most difficult stuff you can get to, but I feel like once you kind of get through a certain point, then it starts to become easier and fun and make just about, all kinds of things more fun and more enjoyable in life, whether you're just living life or watching movies or reading fiction books or all kinds of things. Just life becomes a little more interesting. So yeah, I don't know if you have anything else to add before we wrap it up, and then we'll get together again on Thursday.
Yeah, I'll second that. I think in terms of like always seek out people that are going to challenge you and make you think about things in a different way.
Yeah.
Because without contending with those unknown ideas, you kind of get into your own bubble and you miss things and you assume certain things. And when you challenge your assumptions, that helps you grow and it gives you better footing, as to who you are, having gone through that process.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes it's a painful process. I mean, sometimes you encounter things that really challenge you, and you might have some sleepless nights for a while. But it is that kind of hero's journey. Sometimes you just have to dive in and see what you can come back with. And but if you don't do it, if you don't take the chance of struggling with certain things, then you don't have as much of an appreciation for what you do have as well.
Right.
So.
All right. Well, I guess that's good stuff, and we'll wrap it up. And on Thursday, like I said, we're gonna have at least 6 people that we'll get in a discussion more along the lines of that Sam Harris debate / discussion. We'll be talking about their third discussion, the one that I think was in Dublin. I'll put up more information on that in our Facebook group. But so
if you're interested, maybe we could do some things like this and maybe take some key Jungian ideas and just kind of maybe unpack some little, kind of go through some of the key ideas in Jungian thinking and flesh out some of that. That would be and maybe bring some more people on.
I mean, one thing I want to do. So the tricky thing, and kind of how I got into this whole group that I started last year and everything, is because sometimes I would try to do just that, but just the text and posts and comments, somewhat in my own group, but originally in other Jungian Facebook groups. And the challenge was, I mentioned before that sometimes in those groups or even just in Jungian circles, there gets to be like a Jungian dogma where I would try to talk about maybe a paragraph or a page of a Jungian book or some these concepts like we talked about today, and just kind of have this sort of discussion, and then for whatever reason, I mean, it seems really like an insecurity, just like how dogma can be that way in whatever organizations, but it would get shut down and sometimes even deleted when it was on other groups, because a lot of times people just don't want to have those conversations where somehow it just doesn't line up perfectly with what they're traditionally thinking for whatever reason. But for sure, I'd like to get us and at least 2 or 3 other people and maybe talk about some of these specific things, talk about archetypes, talk about unconscious, individuation, some of those core ideas. And I'm sure we could get at least 2 or 3 other people and just have those discussions, whether it's some that we already are dealing with in our group or pull some people over from some of the other Jungian groups. And maybe in the next couple of weeks, we'll start kind of doing a little series on that.
That'd be cool.
All right. Well, yeah, thanks again, Milo. I'm going to wrap it up. And
Okay.
yeah, we'll talk again by Thursday.
Great.
Okay. All right. Have a good one.
All right.